You're listening to Politics After the Pandemic, where we think transnationally with social scientists and political activists about recent cultural shifts in their relation to COVID-19, capitalism and other structures of oppression, and how social movements, educators, and researchers might respond. I'm Erica Lagalisse, an anthropologist of social movements and your host as we continue in this final installment of my conversation with Ela Drążkiewicz, fellow anthropologist and researcher of conspiracy theory. The main conspiracy theory that was highly unrespectable when I started writing Occult Features of Anarchism was the one about 9/11 being an inside job. My activist friends didn't agree with the priorities of the truthers who towed that line, and they didn't want to be associated with them either, which are actually two different things, aren't they? Like, maybe if we think people are proto-fascists, we might want to associate with them in order to try to stop them from becoming fully actualized fascists, but maybe not if the most important priority is short-term feelings of safety and to not be publicly associated with people with bad politics. I saw people struggling with the same challenges and conflicting desires during the Freedom Convoy movement, and this isn't only a problem in Canada. I can see it everywhere I go launch my book. Italy, Greece, London, New York. To study conspiracy theory after the COVID-19 pandemic necessarily means addressing the relationship of conspiracy theory to respectability, and also how conspiracy theory is cited to manage and position right-wing versus left-wing politics. But enough from me. Let's go back to our interview.
Many left activists in my own research associated tendency toward conspiracy theory with right-wing politics and, navigating the American context during the Trump's presidency. One can see why. But the most recent field of conspiracy theorizing during the pandemic and at other moments in history and in other places, as you point out, highlights the problem with simplistic attributions of right and left in relation to conspiracy theory. Can you tell us a bit more about that, like how your study suggests how the liberal conservative dichotomy gets troubled among vaccine hesitant people?
Yes, so this is, I think, where we are going back to this question about modernity and about how we see conspiracy theories are something that is abnormal, not fully West, which is associated with people who are not reasonable, not educated, which have, so all those, we give them all those characteristics that normally are associated with Western modernity. And to me, that suggests that we think of conspiracy theories as people who are basically non-modern. And then part of it is also thinking of people who endorse conspiracy theories as an enemy from within, as the other, people who have different way of thinking, right? So if your enemy are right-wing populists, then you will associate conspiracy theories with the right-wing populists. And most of the research on conspiracy theories would go in that direction, right?
Right.
Most of what we know about conspiracy theories is based on those kind of groups.
Yes.
At least from within Europe, this kind of research. But there is research like the one you did, and some other work which suggests that it's not always right-wing people, and it's definitely not always that people. We can find people who endorse conspiracy theories on right and left. We can find people who endorse conspiracy theories among those who hold power. Right. Trump, Kaczynski, Orban, there are few, definitely around Europe as well. And you can find conspiracy theories among people who are so-called subaltern underdogs. Right? You can find conspiracy theories among people who are hoping for change. So people who, there is quite interesting work that came from Elvira Wepfer, who worked with Greek environmentalists, and she shows something similar, I guess, to also what you work on, that so much of this environmental movement involves conspiratorial thinking. Why we do not have a change, why people don't care about environment, because there are hidden powers who are plotting and designing designing some plots to harm us because they are benefiting from the lack of change, from protecting environment. So you might have groups who are doing something positive and they want positive change, but they will use conspiracy theories to mobilize the movement. And at the same time, you have all those, people who are anti-climate change, who will, are also excellent example of conspiratorial thinking. So that's why when we are thinking about who believes in conspiracy theories, it's very, for me, it's a hard question because there is so much energy put into quantitative research, which has all those results, I don't know, giving us numbers, that percent of, population with that kind of education believes in this or that. But when you look into details, it's, it's not always the case. And the very good example is also vaccination, anti-vaccination movement. I don't know if that's a movement, but the question of vaccination that a lot of people ask themselves. And there is now a lot of tendency now during COVID to think these are uneducated people. These are right-wing people in the United States or conservative people in Europe who are connected to the Catholic Church, for instance, in Eastern Europe. And these are the ones who do not believe in vaccines. But we also know that there is a big problem with vaccine uptake among nurses who are well educated. We know that there is a big problem in certain pockets of Eastern Europe among doctors who do not believe in COVID. And this is something that medical professionals know very, very well, and they try to deal with it and they want to address it. But it's a very sensitive issue because you don't want to make it a public debate because it might create more harm than good.
It might create more suspicion, yeah. There's something uncomfortable about health workers not having trust in the vaccine because it points to the question of whether or not there actually is reason to potentially distrust the pharmaceutical industry and these institutions. And this is something that's not convenient to talk about, especially right now in the pandemic crisis.
And I think there is, when we talk about it, we have to ask ourselves what is at stake in those conversations, right? Even now, as I say that, I'm like, should I bring it up? Yeah. Because I recognize that we are now in the middle of the pandemic and at stake is our global health. Is that the right moment to start discussing, nurses are also very often expressing conspiratorial, beliefs or vaccine hesitancy?
Well, those of us that are social scientists do find ourselves in a tricky spot with all of this at this moment because our normal role is often to be the ones to have a healthy, critical distrust of institutions and medical discourses and pharmaceutical capitalist interests and all of this business. But right now, if we do our job and we talk about these things, we could be seen as, fueling a dangerous conspiracy theories. There we go, so
and so much also, it's not even like now, it's a really special moment, right, for the studies of conspiracy theories, because definitely so many people rushed to it, to this kind of research, but also so much of this research is, I think, form of boundary making in science, in social sciences or medical sciences, where we want to differentiate what we do vis-a-vis or versus what conspirationists do, people who believe in conspiracy theories. Because if you think about it, we are both groups are involved in some form of investigative practice. Both groups are interested in questions like what is really going on, what is the meaning of this, why those things happen, what is the truth, right? But we want to make sure that there is a difference between a scientific endeavor and conspiratorial investigation. right?
Absolutely. And in my research, one of the things that I notice and point to is the use of conspiracy theory as an epithet, as a sort of appeal to class respectability, something that positions the user of the phrase as someone who is rational and to be respected, vis-a-vis, and in distinction to the conspiracy theorist. And that brings us back to what we were talking about before. And I wanted to pick this up and show how these two things are connected. Like, before you were pointing out how conspiracy theorists are found all over the place. They're not just on the right, and they're not just on the left, and they're not just subalterns, and they're not, sometimes they're elites and so forth. And I like the idea of disrupting the stereotype of the conspiracy theorist as, an uneducated, unmodern, silly person. But I wonder, I don't know how often I'm not sure how often we actually use the phrase conspiracy theorist to refer to elites. We certainly used it to refer to Donald Trump, but in a way, he's a perfect example of a political of a political elite and politician without much class respectability. Because and you pointed to this earlier, that what is a conspiracy theory? If you pick at the definition, it's not clear. If you pick, you see that actually the criteria are often changing and shifting. Like there's
it's very hard to operationalize
and sometimes it's more about who's speaking. Like sometimes it's actually more about who's speaking than what's being said, because some people, as a professor, I could say certain things and be respected as talking about Latin American history. But if someone else who's a truck driver starts talking about the CIA in Nicaragua or something, they could sound a little paranoid, or like if the criteria that are used to determine conspiracy theory were used consistently, then like George Bush's claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction could have easily been considered a conspiracy theory, but it wasn't, right? And the one thing that's always true about the category of conspiracy theory, the only thing that's always true about the category of conspiracy theory, is that it is a phrase used to disqualify speakers from respectable consideration. In this sense, it is a class-based and class-making phrase that itself functions as a way of situating the user as rational and respectable. And
so
having
this is
go on.
This is something that I think the question about, we have two questions here. One, which is what is conspiracy theories and how people use it, engage with it, what is it and how it is used. But then there's a question of the label of conspiracy theory. Right. And that's a different question also. Who applies that label, in what circumstances and what for? And when it is not applied, right? Like the example with George Bush, perhaps it should be applied. But how can we apply it to respectable office of the president, right? And at the same time, we can see how Nayanika Mathur describes it in India in her research, how people in power will use the label of conspiracy theory if they want to dismiss people's claims, if they don't want to deal with people's grievances and questions. And they will dismiss them as, oh, these are just, stories and conspiracy theories. You are all paranoid, go away, right? You hush people with this. I'm not saying this.
Right. It's almost about the right to have ideas. Like if you are a subaltern or working class person and you have an elaborate theory about power, it's sort of like know your place, Whereas if you are someone in a professional class of people who is understood to, work with ideas and be entitled to work with ideas, then when you develop theories about power, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just theory. Or even if you think about it in a different way, like, police, say, or, people working in the legal system would be to get together and figure out, who did what when, where's the conspiracy? If it's common criminals that are doing something, and then the elites are empowered fully to figure out, who was conspiring to do the bad thing. But if it's working class people, they're basically treat them as if they're not entitled to sit around trying to figure out who did what.
But I think it is, the question is what this label does, right? And people can use it in a very manipulative way. And, it can be weaponized and used as a political weapon. The label, conspiracy theories can be used as a political weapon, right? But I think it's also our job as researchers to also think about those questions: when, who, why uses the label, but we still also have to do research on conspiracy theories. And for me, it is also interesting why in certain locations this, for instance, this label didn't stick, right? Yeah. So much of what is going on in Poland could be the narratives that are at play on all sides of political spectrum could be defined as conspiratorial thinking, right? There is a lot of conspiratorial thinking in Polish politics, but this label is not really used too much and too often. It is actually, I find it very new in Polish politics. Maybe the last 10 years it started to be used, mostly because of the presidential plane crash in Smolensk, when things like when the biggest conspiracy theory in Poland in recent years was mobilized, but it's not really the language that people use in daily lives.
Do you think that there's maybe an international sort of cultural diffusion going on, where during the Trump presidency, the phrase conspiracy theory became very prominent, at least in English-speaking media, and it started to be used as a self-evident category, and then that somehow travels around and gets picked up in other places? Is that possible?
I think from what I observe, I think for Poland, Eastern Europe, more important was COVID. This is when the discourse really accelerated. I think. I'm not a historian of a concept, so I don't really know that. That's my kind of observation so far. But the question that I am interested in is what happens when the stories that used to be known as stories of idiots, just crazy people, lies, or, just stories that don't stick together. What happens when we change them from being that to being conspiracy theories? What happens when we start using the label of conspiracy theories? And I think that part of it is that while the stories of a crazy uncle, proverbial crazy uncle at the dinner who comes with the stories, right, and has his theories, they can be ignored, dismissed. It's uncle talking again, right? Yeah. Who cares? Let's pretend we haven't heard it. When we label it conspiracy theories, we have to take action. We have to position ourselves. Do we speak to uncle or not? Do we invite the uncle for Christmas ever again or not? Maybe we should send uncle for some re-education. He should educate himself, right? So I feel that there is a lot of this action, which and certain practice and processes that are mobilized the moment we mobilize the label, that it changes relationships between people, and it changes, it prescribes a certain procedure.
When I hear these case studies that you've done, is that basically all of these paranoid theories can be understood in the same way as the organ stealing myths in Brazil can, right? Like as an allegorical index of what are actually very real forms of oppression, like just as the stealing of organs could index literally the blood of the workers and the raw materials being extracted from colonized regions of the global south. Stories about being implanted with microchips clearly index widespread anxiety over increasing surveillance, which was on the rise even before I needed a QR code to get into a restaurant, which is the case we're living right now, And as for 5G towers damaging health and sapping free will and all this, well, this is likewise very possibly connected with the general cultural anxiety over the health and social effects of the increasing use of digital devices and knowledge of an inevitable growing reliance on these as soon as we're all isolated in our homes. Like maybe it's not a coincidence that as soon as we're isolated 5G is also what we want more than anything, to stay connected to other humans. Like maybe there's a alienation of desire going on. I don't know, there's a lot of allegory to unpack. We can't do it all today, but clearly in America, as in Eastern Europe, as in Africa, it makes sense to understand why it makes sense to try to understand why even apparently silly things make sense to others, not because we then have to agree, but because insofar as anyone might want to change someone's mind, it helps to understand how and why people have the ideas they do, which is what you're saying, and how you finish off in the paper as well. I noticed, making a point to say that addressing the existential concerns underwriting conspiracy theory may be more effective than simply just trying to provide correct information, right?
I think perhaps for me, what is important to have less of this surprise that people believe in conspiracy theories. In a way, I think when bad things happen, when there is catastrophe, when there is an event which is hard to explain, such as pandemic, when plane crash, when there is natural disaster, when illness hits the family, I think people are looking for answers, and it is not surprising that they are looking for answers and understandings, and they want to make a meaning of those events. So I wish that when we are talking about conspiracy theories, when we are thinking about why people believe in those, endorse those, we had a little bit of understanding of, and we also have some consideration for where it all started, why people might have those kind of thoughts, even if they might be thoughts which are harmful, dangerous, horrible. Very often, I think it is important to ask also how it starts, where it starts, because if we do not learn where it all starts, why people start engaging with conspiratorial thinking, if we do not ask what are the causes of those theories, we will not be able to address them and to deal with the issues that very often they can cause.
In the first episode, I talked about how orthodox social theory generally involves a structural or post-structural theory of social change, where history unfolds due to relatively impersonal forces. I mentioned Marx's dialectic and Foucault's discourse as examples. Conspiracy theory, on the other hand, is judged harshly partly due to honoring a voluntarist theory of history, where the activities of individuals and groups can and do change the course of events. Now, I'm a social scientist too. I do structural analysis for a living. I even still like structuralism as a body of theory, and that's a bit passé, so I'm all for systemic analysis. But, precisely for that reason, it's also nice to do a systemic analysis of social theory itself and ask questions like, hey, given that for decades now social scientists have cited Michel Foucault, I mean, not always in ways that Foucault would appreciate, mind you, but social scientists do clearly enjoy citing Foucault to elaborate the constraints of discourse and institutional power on their own activity, perhaps even while highlighting resistance among people living in relative poverty. So maybe we should ask if conspiracy theory is uncomfortable for that kind of intellectual elite because it highlights the social power they do structurally enjoy and therefore inconvenient responsibilities that they do actually have. Maybe intellectual elites don't want to think about the fact that they do enjoy more power to affect institutional affairs than the janitor does, because then they'd have to feel partially responsible for the workings of global capitalism instead of blaming a sexist, racist, homophobic janitor, which is clearly more convenient. Some social scientists find it surprising that persons in oppressed groups find the activity of dominant groups suffused with so much intentionality that elites cannot see. But that idea is not really that different than what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu says when he writes about elites acting in their own class interest, but misrecognizing it when they do it. Sometimes I really do wish I could get Foucault and Bourdieu back here together, mud wrestling over conspiracy theory, because the fact is, chosen definitions of rationality and how one understands power, as well as one's proclivity toward an impersonal or structural versus personal and voluntarist understanding of history, do appear related to social class, where both elite and popular theorists enjoy different insights and suffer different blind spots. Meanwhile, whether we like it or not, many traditional social movement organizations and activists on the left are now faced with articulating an effective anti-capitalist politics after a populist right capture of dissent in multiple global contexts. And to do so, it's going to be helpful to really think through conspiracy theory as a concept and practical political challenge. I hope that this discussion has helped listeners understand how social science approaches to conspiracy theory can help us intervene practically in the world, and also that this discussion of conspiracy theory has helped listeners to understand what it means to do anthropology and to think about power like a social scientist. Those of you who are keen to continue thinking critically about conspiracy theory, check out the links on the podcast webpage to Ela's writing in the book Viral Loads. Her piece that we discussed today can be found there. There is also another link to a different podcast Ela did about conspiracy theory at the London School of Economics last year. Ela's latest study is titled Virtuosos of Mimesis and Mimicry, Movements Propagating Conspiracy Theories in Civil Society in Ireland and Poland, and it looks into how organizations promoting conspiracy theory maintain and expand their influence despite pushback by evoking the strategies of other more legitimate members of civil society and NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. I provide the link for this article on the podcast webpage as well. You can also follow links to find my work on the plays of identity as property and the dynamics of good politics among anarchist activists in North America. The shortest summary currently available is the anthropology chapter in the Sage Handbook of Marxism published this year, which is very academic for those who like that sort of thing. I'm working on a more pop version now, I promise. You can also find links to my book, Occult Features of Anarchism, and to my lecture at the London School of Economics on that book, as well as to videos of the version of that lecture I delivered at psychedelic trance festivals this summer. As I said in an earlier episode, those listeners specifically interested in public scholarship on conspiracy theory or any other topic might get something out of comparing those expositions, then looking up a word called heteroglossolalia, which kind of means knowing your audience, which usually means never using the word heteroglossolalia. The reference for that impressive piece of vocabulary is Bakhtin, found in the bibliography of this podcast, which I also invite you to check out. All of the references to studies that Ela makes in our interview can be found there. And if you want an even longer reading list on the social science of conspiracy theory, I'd say check out the bibliographies of Occult Features of Anarchism and of Ela's chapter in Viral Loads. This has been Politics After the Pandemic. Thanks for listening.
Politics After the Pandemic is brought to you by the Sociological Review Foundation in collaboration with the British Academy as part of the special section Solidarity and Care during the COVID-19 pandemic. Erika Lagalisse is an anthropologist and researcher at the London School of Economics and Loughborough University, and author of the book Occult Features of Anarchism.